The golden chandeliers of Buckingham Palace have witnessed centuries of calculated whispers, political maneuvers, and closely guarded secrets. But nothing could prepare the ancient walls of the council chamber for the sheer explosion of raw emotion that was about to unfold. On this seemingly ordinary afternoon, a high-level meeting had been convened, presided over by King Charles himself, intended to settle the internal redistribution of the royal family's extensive network of charities, estates, and historic patronages. Seated rigidly beside the monarch was Queen Camilla, a woman who had spent the better part of her life navigating public scrutiny, weathering intense media storms, and meticulously rebuilding her image, all to finally claim the crown and secure her place at the absolute pinnacle of royal society. Her posture was, as always, defensive yet proud, an armor built from decades of survival within the cold mechanisms of the court, her eyes sweeping the room to ensure that her hard-won authority was respected by everyone present. Across the massive polished oak conference table sat Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent, one of the most steadfast, loyal, and respected members of the firm, a man whose quiet dignity had anchored the family through countless crises, and who was still visibly carrying the heavy burden of grief nearly a year after the passing of his beloved wife, the late Duchess of Kent. Beside him sat Catherine, the Princess of Wales, embodying that signature grace, quiet composure, and effortless dignity that had captured the hearts of millions around the globe, making her the undeniable symbol of the monarchy's future. The atmosphere in the room was already thick with unspoken tension, a suffocating silence where even the softest rustle of paper felt like a jarring intrusion, because every single individual in that room understood the fragile dynamics at play and the underlying power struggles that continuously rippled beneath the surface of royal protocol. The silence was abruptly shattered when Prince Edward cleared his throat, his weathered hand steadying a document as he looked directly across the table, his voice carrying an unexpected weight that immediately locked the attention of everyone in the room. He did not engage in the usual diplomatic pleasantries or lengthy preambles. Instead, he blindsided the entire gathering by reading aloud the final, deeply personal wishes of his late wife, wishes that had been kept confidential until this very moment. The document explicitly detailed the transfer of decades of the Kent family's most prestigious patronages, historic charitable foundations, and deep-rooted community legacies directly to Catherine, the Princess of Wales, bypassing the traditional channels that would normally see such honors pass to the reigning queen. As the words echoed off the wood-paneled walls, Catherine responded with the exact reverence and humility that had defined her public life, bowing her head in deep respect for the memory of the deceased Duchess, accepting the monumental responsibility without a single hint of triumph or gloat. But on the other side of the table, the reaction was instantaneous and terrifyingly intense, as Queen Camilla's gaze froze, her eyes widening in a mixture of disbelief and sudden, overwhelming fury. Her fingers tightened against the fabric of her skirt so hard that her knuckles turned stark white, her carefully constructed mask of queenly serenity completely fracturing in a single second. To Camilla, this was not merely an administrative reassignment of charitable duties or a simple distribution of family obligations. It was a devastating psychological blow, a public declaration that her decades of sacrifice, her endurance through public hatred, and her current standing as the highest-ranking royal lady were being actively minimized and overshadowed by the younger generation. Envy and a paralyzing fear being pushed into permanent irrelevance began to consume her mind, eroding the calculated restraint she had relied upon for years, forcing her into a desperate, cornered state. She shot a piercing, frantic glance at King Charles, silently demanding that her husband intervene, that the monarch use his supreme authority to push back against this perceived injustice and defend her honor, but she received absolutely nothing in return. The king remained entirely motionless, his eyes cast downward, his silence speaking volumes and confirming the brutal reality that he had not only been aware of this decision beforehand, but had given it his full, official sovereign approval. That silence from the king was the absolute breaking point for Camilla, a spark that ignited a lifetime of suppressed resentments and insecurities into a roaring, uncontrollable fire. Abandoning every single rule of royal decorum, diplomatic protocol, and basic courtly restraint, Camilla stood up abruptly in the middle of the solemn proceedings, the heavy wooden legs of her chair scraping against the polished floor with a loud, jarring screech that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the quiet room. Every eye in the chamber locked onto her in utter astonishment. Courtiers held their breath, and King Charles's face contorted into an expression of deep trouble and profound embarrassment as he watched his wife unravel. Camilla's face had turned a ghostly, deathly pale, yet her eyes were blazing with defiant, uncontrollable anger that defied centuries of palace tradition. Her chest heaved with shallow, rapid breaths as she struggled to control the visible trembling of her lips, her bloodshot eyes betraying the deep-seated humiliation that was driving her actions. She did not use vulgar language, but her voice was razor-sharp, dripping with intense condemnation and a bitter, venomous rage as she began to openly question the Duke of Kent's authority and fairness. She launched into a passionate, desperate defense of her own record, aggressively listing her years of unyielding service to crown, the sacrifices she made, and the burden she carried alongside Charles, demanding to know why a legacy of such historic importance was being swept out of her hands and handed to someone so young. Her gaze swept across the room like a weapon, trying to force the silent onlookers to validate her outrage, to acknowledge the blatant unfairness she believed was being inflicted upon her. It was a tragic, chaotic display of a woman who felt her hard-earned power slipping away, a queen fighting a losing battle against the unstoppable tide of the future, completely blind to the fact that her hysterical outburst was destroying the very dignity she was trying so desperately to protect. The air in the council chamber grew exponentially colder as Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent, met Queen Camilla's fiery, emotional outburst not with matched anger, but with an absolute, immovable silence that fell heavier than the stone foundations of the palace itself. He remained completely motionless, looking like an ancient monument weathered by time, his hands clasped firmly on the table with his knuckles whitening slightly, yet his facial expression remained entirely unreadable and composed. When the queen finally stopped speaking, her breath ragged and her chest still heaving from her desperate plea, the duke slowly raised his head, locking his piercing gaze directly onto her panic-stricken eyes. His response, delivered in a low, resonant baritone that cut through the lingering echoes of her shouting, was completely devoid of political theater or personal malice. He calmly stated that he was not present in this chamber to distribute power, negotiate alliances, or dispense favors to satisfy anyone's ambition. He was there for one singular, sacred purpose: to carry out the precise, legally documented final wishes of his late wife, the Duchess of Kent, whose devotion to the crown and her specific patronages was absolute. The sheer contrast between Camilla's desperate, frantic clinging to royal authority and Edward's unyielding, unbreakable loyalty to his deceased wife's command was so stark, so devastatingly profound, that not a single courtier or royal member in the room dared to breathe loudly, let alone intervene. Even King Charles could only purse his lips in profound sorrow, his fingers gripping his gold fountain pen so tightly it looked as though it might snap. Torn between his personal devotion to his unraveling wife and his immense respect for his steadfast cousin, before Camilla could formulate a counter-argument or recover from the initial rejection, the Duke of Kent delivered what could only be described as a fatal psychological blow that effectively dismantled her remaining defenses in front of the entire assembly. With a voice that remained chillingly calm, he brought up the memory of the Duchess of Kent's funeral, which had taken place nearly a year prior, a solemn occasion where the family had been left to mourn a monumental loss. He reminded the room, with devastating clarity, how Queen Camilla had used a sudden, convenient decline in her own health as an excuse to be completely absent from the services, leaving the grieving Kent family to walk behind the coffin alone, without the comfort of the reigning queen consort. Edward revived that painful, hidden memory right there in the open court, exposing what he perceived as her past selfishness, indifference, and lack of genuine duty toward the family members who had supported the monarchy for decades. Then, shifting his gaze away from the pale, trembling queen, the Duke looked directly toward Catherine, the Princess of Wales, who had been sitting in perfect, dignified silence throughout the entire chaotic ordeal. He pointed out to the room that while the reigning queen had chosen to evade her fundamental duty, it was the young Princess of Wales who had stepped forward without hesitation, selflessly taking Camilla's place, fulfilling the vital mourning rituals, leading the funeral procession, and comforting the broken family with absolute, unmistakable sincerity. This contrast was absolutely devastating. It proved to everyone watching that true royal worthiness is not defined by crowns, titles, or marital status, but by who actually shows up to do the heavy emotional and spiritual work when the family and the nation need them most. The weight of the truth seemed to trap Camilla in a corner of her own making, her face transitioning from a flush of anger to a deathly, hollow paleness as her lips moved silently, without any words coming out. Seizing the absolute momentum of the moment, Prince Edward reached deep into the inner pocket of his formal suit jacket and pulled out a physical document that caused an invisible, suffocating weight to press down upon the entire chamber. It was an envelope made of heavy parchment, slightly yellow with the passage of time, but preserved with immaculate, reverent care, bearing the official wax seal and the unmistakable crest of the late Duchess of Kent. With deliberate, slow movements, he opened the envelope and laid the handwritten letter flat upon the polished oak table, allowing the ink strokes, neat yet visibly unsteady due to the severe illness of the Duchess's final days, to be seen by everyone present, especially King Charles. The letter explicitly documented, in her own handwriting, her profound anxiety regarding the future of the charities, arts organizations, and military veterans she had spent a lifetime supporting, and her absolute, unshakable faith that Catherine was the only one capable of flourishing that legacy. Upon seeing the authentic handwriting and the sacred seal of the deceased, any lingering political arguments or accusations of conspiracy completely disintegrated into dust, prompting a soft, collective sigh of acknowledgement from the king and the surrounding courtiers. Realizing that her final desperate defenses had been utterly shattered, the last remnant of Camilla's royal dignity collapsed entirely, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs as the reality of her total public humiliation washed over her. Blinded by a toxic cocktail of intense envy, wounded pride, and a terrifying realization of her own isolation within the family, she plunged into an unprecedented state of total, uncontrolled hysteria right in the middle of the sacred council chamber. The high walls of the council chamber, built to echo only the most restrained diplomatic murmurs, became the stage for a historical catastrophe as Queen Camilla's absolute loss of control dissolved the final barrier of royal decorum. Her choked, fractured sobs rang out clearly, a desperate sound that violated every unwritten law of the contemporary court, stripping away the carefully managed veneer of the matriarch she had worked for years to project to the British public. The heavy tears streaming down her pale face were not born from a sudden wave of genuine remorse or deep heartbreak, but from the unadulterated fury of an exceptionally proud woman who realized her political weapons had been utterly destroyed by a ghost. She threw her shoulders up, her entire frame shaking with violent, terrifying tremor, and in a hoarse, unrecognizable voice, she loudly condemned both King Charles and Prince Edward right in front of the gathered courtiers. She screamed that the decision was a calculated, vicious betrayal of a faithful wife who had carried the physical and emotional burdens of the king, explicitly accusing them of forming a covert alliance to banish her name into forgotten, dark corners of the palace. The chamber plunged into an unprecedented, terrifying state of chaos, with senior aides and royal secretaries sitting entirely paralyzed, their eyes darting frantically between the reigning monarch and the hysterical queen, nobody knowing the correct security protocol to handle a dynastic fracture being exposed as rawly. King Charles raised his hands multiple times, his severe face filled with a desperate plea as he gestured for his wife to stop, tried to remind her through his eyes of the immense dignity expected of Queen, but Camilla, completely blinded by a toxic thirst for power and systemic envy, ignored every single silent warning. She pressed her weight forward toward the conference table, her fingers clawing frantically at the edge of the documents as if she intended to tear the late Duchess's letter to shreds, her shouting growing increasingly shrill until the atmosphere became entirely unbearable. It was at this exact fraction of a second that King Charles's legendary patience officially reached its absolute breaking point. He closed his eyes briefly, inhaling a long, painful breath that seemed to age him by a decade, and made an agonizing but definitive sovereign choice to protect the sanctity of the crown over the emotions of his wife. He turned his head slowly and gave a sharp, unyielding nod to the head guard stationed by the massive, towering oak doors of the council chamber. Two royal guards dressed in immaculate formal attire stepped inward without a moment's hesitation, their heavy leather boots echoing with a cold, unmerciful precision against the stone floor as they moved toward the royal table. They approached Queen Camilla with absolute professionalism, firmly blocking her path and assuming a rigid escort posture, politely but unyieldingly requesting her immediate departure from the chamber. The moment the guards placed their gloved hands near Camilla's arms to gently but forcefully guide her away, the entire room held its breath in a collective state of shock. She attempted to break free from their grip, her wild eyes still locked onto Catherine with a look of absolute, burning hatred, but the mechanism of the state had already turned against her. The reigning queen consort of the United Kingdom was physically escorted out of the high-level meeting room to the utter, breathless disbelief of every powerful witness present in the realm. The heavy wooden door clicked shut with a definitive heavy sound, completely severing her bitter, fading lamentations in the room and leaving behind a terrifyingly hollow silence that would forever remain an unprecedented, permanent stain on her life as consort. The suffocating silence hung in the air for what felt like an eternity, leaving King Charles sitting entirely motionless in the sovereign chair, his face deeply etched with the lines of profound exhaustion, disappointment, and personal grief. Yet he was still the monarch, and the relentless machinery of the British crown did not afford him the luxury of collapsing under personal trauma or delaying state business. He took a long, measured breath to reclaim his composure, smoothed the front of his jacket, and gave a subtle, authoritative nod to the royal secretary to present the final instruments of state, with a steady hand holding his gold fountain pen. Charles signed his official approval upon the document bearing the crimson wax seal, legally finalizing the transfer of power. From that exact moment, Catherine, the Princess of Wales, officially became the sole custodian, manager, and director of the massive, multi-tiered network of patronages, military veteran support organizations, and historic arts foundations that the Kent family had spent their entire lives constructing. Meanwhile, in an entirely different, isolated wing of the palace, Camilla was facing the devastating aftermath of her self-inflicted downfall, confined within the cold walls of her private bedchamber. Her frantic resistance had altered absolutely nothing about the legal reality, but had successfully dismantled the last remaining shred of her public respect, forcing her to realize that the cold wheels of royal power turned relentlessly onward for no one, not even a queen. As she sat in darkness by the windowsill, watching the far-off silhouette of Catherine confidently ascending to the peak of her new public duties, the Duke of Kent slowly presented the young princess with a priceless family heirloom, an exquisitely crafted sapphire and diamond brooch that had belonged to his late wife. As Catherine pinned the glittering jewel to her lapel, receiving the sacred spiritual legacy with profound reverence, the subterranean war for the ultimate future of the crown had officially ignited its fuse, ensuring that while Catherine had won the hearts of the people, the storm within the palace walls was only just beginning to brew.